They know what happens when the arse falls out of the market, when the price tanks, whether it's agriculture, whether it's mining, whatever it is. They don't want to be in that position. What they want to see is the future vision. They want to see how Australia is going to transition, how, you know, we have a really strong industry in terms of our mining. That will continue for some time. You know, our coal is some of the highest quality coal in the whole world. We're going to need that coal to build steel for the foreseeable future at least, even if we are transitioning to more renewable energy to generate electricity in Australia. So let's have those conversations. Let's not completely blow it up politically every time we mention the word, and let's focus on the things that are important to people, which is you know, the hip pocket, which is the cost to them, which is how they're going to get their energy, how they're going to use their energy, what their job's going to look like, what their community is going to look like, and what policies we need in an election campaign. We'd hope we might get them to take us to that place, even given the odd curveball as we're getting at the moment.
And David, how uncomfortable would this be for those moderate Liberals who are facing challenges from the teal independents, so-called, who are campaigning very hard on climate change? You know, would it be distressing for someone like the Treasurer Frydenberg to have this breakout today?
Well, not welcome, but a lot of people in the coalition recognise that Matt has a passionate view. He's long argued his corner. He didn't get it up as policy, but he's, you know, still cracking on now, trying to affect things. But people understand that. And I'd say in the coalition too, there's a greater tolerance of alternative views and dissent. And, you know, as broad church, it's officially different from the Labor Party, where things like crossing the floor get you expelled from the party. The coalition's more comfortable with a diversity of views. So, of course, in the teal seats, you know, that's not going to play well. But
I mean, and the press releases write themselves for the independents, don't they? You know, your local Liberal member, whether it's Frydenberg or Sharma or whoever else, has a record of voting in line with Matt Canavan and Barnaby Joyce. You vote for this fellow or woman, you get Matt Canavan and Barnaby Joyce. I mean, that's the lines that have come out of those teal independents. And what you're describing is a kind of inside Canberra bubble understanding of how a very senior senator's voice should be considered.
Well, I would say there's also a trade-off in a number of those coal seats, like Hunter Valley and Capricornia, Flynn. You know, in politics often there's an equal and opposite reaction. So you might think, oh, not good in the teal seats, but on the other hand, maybe Matt's view gives voice to a group of people who might otherwise be voting for, say, One Nation or Clive Palmer or someone like that. So you've got to take it in the round. I don't think it'll have any big impact one way or the other.
Yeah. Noreen, funny question to ask you as a Labor Party member, but are you concerned for the future of the moderate wing of the Liberal Party, given all these challenges from teal independents?
I am actually. I have always thought that it served Australian society well that the moderate wing of the Liberal Party, that genuine small L Liberals existed and had an influence in that party. And I think around something like coal, it's a really good example. I disagree with you, Fiona. I think there has been a really productive discussion going on across civil society about coal, about in our employment community, for example, about a just transition and about, and I think, Amanda, you know, there is a lot of policy work, being done by the trade union movement, for example, on where coal workers can transition to, and interventionist kind of agricultural strategies that would provide work. So I think that in terms of the Liberal Party, those moderates could well have been part of that discussion and made a really good and big contribution to it. I've worked with some over the years on a whole lot of issues, particularly around feminist issues, and I think it's really sad because the coal agenda and the renewable agenda has been controlled by a couple of not very bright men trying to make point prove. And the rest of us as an Australian community have been held hostage by Matt Canavan and George Christensen and, God help us, Malcolm Roberts. And so the loss of the moderates within the Liberal Party playing in the contributing to the policy agenda, the loss to independence, I think would be really sad. But gotta say, if it happens, let's see what happens. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion as yet.
Okay.
But let's see what happens in the election. It would be sad.
In the minute or two left, just a quick one to David and Fiona. Just on this claim from the Prime Minister that Labor plans to introduce a carbon tax. What they're referring to is something called the safeguard mechanism, which is something that requires a gradual cut in transmissions from the industrial sector in order to get to net zero by 2050. That's not a carbon tax, is it, David?
Well, not strictly by the definition of tax, but what they're really talking about is there an extra impost that might come from including these in the scheme to a point where they have to pay additional fees. So, and how might that be passed on? So, this is the 10th iteration of this whole debate from when Howard proposed an emissions reduction scheme back in 2007. Kevin Rudd, there was
Please don't take us
iterations.
through the entire history. We'll be here for the rest of the night.
I know, it's very,
We'll
depressing.
We'll run a highlights reel later tonight on the news channel for those who really want to,
Look, the Productivity Commission recommended a market-based system back in the early 90s. That's how far back it goes, and so the policymakers have been pretty consistent on that, and could have probably avoided a lot of heartache if we'd got a Howard's or Rudd's scheme up in the early days. Might have saved a few Prime Minister's skins.
That's like saying, how do you get to Dublin? Well, I wouldn't start from here. Here is where we are. So my point to you is, if the Business Council of Australia supports a safeguard mechanism to ratchet down emissions, as every sector has to do, and within the BCA we have AGL, big supplier of electricity and gas, the big miner BHP, the oil company BP, the big steel producer BlueScope, which takes a lot of electricity to make steel, and that electricity comes from coal, then why would there be a scare campaign emerging about the safeguard mechanism that the people who'd have to implement it themselves are asking for?
Well, I think part of that lies in Labor seemingly unable to explain with clarity what it means. So, I think that's contributed a lot to it.
Fiona, just this, I'm supposed to be winding this up, but if you think about it, if you think about the task, electricity's 35% of our emissions, and 1 in 3 houses has a solar panel. Okay, so we're getting there on that stuff, and we've got broad-scale solar being introduced by the states and territories. Then you go to energy, mining and industry, 18%, transport, 17%, and a big chunk of that, nearly all of that, is cars. So electric vehicles would sort that out. Then there's agriculture, 13%. Your sector's committed to net zero. Why shouldn't industrial processes at 6% and fugitive emissions from, which is processing at coal mines, 13%, be subject to the same ratcheting down of emissions as everybody else?
Well, I think they probably are. I mean, without understanding exactly what is meant by the current terminology that everybody's using, which until you see the detail, you're not. I mean, I think actually we are on this pathway, and everybody has to be on that pathway. And I think generally people are, and companies are, and everybody is.
So what's the benefit in the middle of an election campaign saying shock horror carbon tax?
Well, I don't know. I know for our sector, what we want is certainty around the science that's going to take us there. How is the soil carbon? How does soil carbon work? How do you get it in there? How do you keep it in there? Where is it stored? What happens? How can we actually transition some of our fuels? How can we actually transition some of the energy needs that we have on farm? That's what's going to take our sector there. So I think, when you hear about some of the major mining companies, the major electricity providers, they all do have targets. So, I think let's be really clear what we're talking about. It's been politicised. This whole thing has been politicised so often, so much. We can play the reel later. But at the moment, what we need to do is to keep focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. We have been, really focusing on it, and we don't want to go back to the old political wars again. We just need to put one foot in front of the other. Every sector needs to progress that way, and I think that's what we have to be talking about.
You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, President of the National Farmers Federation, Fiona Simpson, in Canberra tonight, Managing Director of Barton Deacon's Federal Division and former Liberal advisor, David Alexander. In Sydney tonight, Industry Professor at Jumbunna Institute of Education and Research at the University of Technology and Labor Party member Noreen Young. And in Melbourne, Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity and Non-Executive Board Director, Amanda Young. The Solomon Islands and the Pacific more broadly have unexpectedly become topics of discussion over Australian dinner tables in recent days. Basically, folks are worried that China is going to expand its military presence to within a few thousand kilometres of Australian shores. Labor has seized the moment by outlining its plan for the Pacific, which takes a soft power approach, providing more aid and closer economic ties with the region. But the government says the opposition's out of its depth on Pacific foreign policy. The Drum's David Taylor looks back at the developments in the Pacific in recent weeks and what both major parties are doing to respond to them.
Fears are building that China is laying the groundwork to build a military facility or naval base in Solomon Islands.
Our overriding sort of grand strategic aim in the region is to make sure that a hostile foreign major power doesn't get a security foothold in the region, and that has collapsed in the last couple of weeks.
China says it's simply helping the Pacific Island nation out with social order, aid and combating natural disasters. But a leaked draft of the security deal between the two countries suggests Chinese warships could stop in Solomon Islands for logistical replenishment, and that China could send police and armed forces there to assist in maintaining social order.
Let me assure the people of Solomon Islands.
Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare insists no Chinese military bases would be built in his country.
National interests.
And Australia, at least at an official diplomatic level, has accepted his word on that. With a general election now a few weeks away, both major parties are pitching their regional defence plans. The coalition is committed to spending $1.85 billion over the coming year in development assistance in the Pacific. It's also providing additional defence, policing, economic and health security assistance, bringing the government's total support to roughly $2.7 billion in this financial year. The Department of Foreign Affairs has also established 6 additional diplomatic posts in the Pacific since 2018. Labor's Pacific plan sees more aid and closer regional ties. It's announced it'll set up a new Australia-Pacific Defence School to provide training for members of defence and security forces from Pacific Island nations at a cost of $6.5 million over 4 years. It's doubling funding for the Pacific Maritime Security Fund, boosting it by $12 million a year from 2024 to 2025. It's also promising to deliver an Indo-Pacific broadcasting strategy that boosts Australian public and commercial media content to audiences in our region, including $8 million for the ABC. And the establishment of a Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership to support clean energy infrastructure projects in Pacific countries.
The prospect of a Chinese base less than 2,000 kilometres from Australia's coastline is dramatically detrimental to Australia's security interests. And that is a kill on Mr Morrison's watch.
The government says Labor's plans are out of step with reality.
Labor appears to want to say that increases in development assistance will stop Beijing's attempts to pursue a security presence in the Pacific. I'm concerned that that does not recognise the geostrategic realities.
So, what is the right approach?
We've had a lot of investment in defence, but it's not being backed up by investment in other areas. And of course, to do strategy properly is not just about the hard power, it's about the economic power, the soft power, the diplomatic power. And really what I think is happening here is a lack of coordination on this effort. And what we've seen from Labor in response to this is, of course, a commitment of just over $500 million over 4 years. And I think a lot of that will just go to restoring the balance of what's been lost. And if they did get elected, it would be interesting to see how they coordinate that development aid and how they focus it. Because what I think we need to do is also look at new and different ways of how we engage with the Pacific.
And, of course, what do Pacific nations want the most help with? Well, the Fijian Prime Minister told the UN General Assembly that Australia and its AUKUS partners should shift their focus to what the Pacific sees as the highest priority: climate change.
You're nodding away there, Amanda Young, at that final line about climate change. You're a South Sea Islander woman yourself, fourth generation from Vanuatu. Before we move on, just tell me that history.
Oh, okay. So my great-great-grandparents, 3 of the 4 came from Vanuatu, about 1850s or so. They were the Kanaka slave labourers. So they were either coerced, tricked, or brought over to Australia to work originally for cotton, then to farm cane. And my family settled around the Queensland-New South Wales border, and we've been here ever since. And somehow we managed to hang in here, even when we had the White Australia policy and there were laws passed to repel us and send us all back home to the Pacific Islands, because Australia decided that white is right. And so, yeah, that sort of brings us to the current day and me being on the drum.
Okay, and we hear a lot about the fears and priorities of Australia right now. When we see the growing relationship between Honiara and Beijing. Give us another perspective, the perspective we need to start hearing, which is what are the fears and priorities in the Pacific?
So it's funny when you get the chance to tell people what the other side of history is. You'll hear your hegemonic sort of the main story that Westerners tell themselves, and that is that the Pacific's a lovely place where we go and have our holidays. And yet for us, Australia's only looking at now. I heard the word now so many times in that grab. And for us, it's 170 years of now. It's been a relationship that's been going for a really long time. And the relationship has travelled and traversed some really fraught terrain, from starting with the slavery history, where many South Sea Islanders died in Australia in really abject poverty, forced to work for years with no pay and appalling conditions. That was the start of the relationship, and it moved from there to this sort of seasonal, insecure, precarious work that was offered, where you got to be pickers and no financial security, no economic benefits, and you certainly wouldn't share in the wealth of Australia. No, your labour was all that was needed and you can go back home. And so, moving into the next iteration, which was security, we'll bring our army and help you sort out your messes, because the stresses of the lack of economic opportunity were really starting to tell, and there was, civil unrest as a result. All of these have just played perfectly into China's hands. And then, of course, we hit the now, and the now is existential crisis. We are not going to survive if you do not help us. And it didn't help to have a hot mic sitting over our leaders as a nation while they were laughing at the water lapping at the ankles of Pacific Islanders. So when you add that context to the story, the piece that I think Australia's really not match fit in is as a result of not negotiating a treaty with First Nations people in the first place and learning the skills about the real currency that's needed now, and that's trust, how to build partnerships and work with sovereign nations on an equal footing. Power. I heard soft power, I heard hard power, I heard the word power so many times in that piece. And that's power. It's about us having power over the Solomons as Australia. No, what we're talking about is this. And Australia doesn't have much training in it. It doesn't know how to do that. All the Pacific needs to do is point to the Indigenous people of Australia and say, well, this is how you treat your own people. And so we've got to really rapidly not build a defence school, although that might be a great idea. We need to build our own capability to be good partners, to listen with transparency, act with integrity and transparency, and hear from the Pacific Islanders what they want. And it's a very clear message. No one's under any doubt here. Help us to survive, cut your emissions.
We have a guest, but I just want to go to you on that, Noreen. Just leave aside Labor's policy and Coalition's policy. We'll come to that in just a sec. But the use of the language, hard power, soft power, this kind of idea of a voice of America, the ABC broadcasting in our values, right? Are you reluctant about any of that?
Well, I'm torn. I think Amanda Agree with everything you say. And of course, your mob is so inextricably tied in with ours. And we would consider Pacifica people family. I was in Vanuatu about 15 years ago with some kids, with my kids and other kids, and they were watching the local telly, and who they used to call, and I quote, Yamba the Curry Worm came on, which was this show on NITV that was, you know, obviously Indigenous themed, and there was like a Muppety type figure that was a worm with the Aboriginal colours. Or it wasn't a worm, something else. Anyway, I was thinking at the time how interesting that is. Is that an imposition of, is the Australian television the imposition of our culture? How excellent it was that Indigenous culture was being beamed in. But we've heard since then how much people in the Pacific miss it. And I suppose to me, the nature of that soft diplomacy and the cleverness of it was juxtaposed yesterday with the buff-headedness of the Prime Minister saying his quip was, Labor are going to send the ABC in, are going to send Q&A in. So the political position being, we'll take a hit at the ABC by removing it from the Pacific because we're so clever and we like to point prove, and we're now seeing the results. Excellent. Good one.
We'll hear another...
Gotta wonder.
Yep. We'll hear some more perspectives on the Coalition and Labor policy. To tell us more, we're joined by former White House National Security and Pentagon Policy Advisor Jason Israel. Thanks for joining us, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have said that if the Chinese put a naval base at Honiara, that would be a red line. Now, Beijing and Honiara say we've got no plans to do that. But you were based in Djibouti when China built its first overseas military base there. You were there for the United States. How much of a concern is it that after the push into Africa, there looks like there's a push into the Pacific?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And what I'd like to do is just start with the perspective of China is, of course, a growing power. And it has, you know, ambitions to conduct trade with the rest of the world, and it's made that public through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So you would think that it's going to try to create, you know, facilities throughout. So that's an expectation. So when you talk about Djibouti, which is sort of the western end of the Indian Ocean at the Horn of Africa, and where it established its first base, it actually makes sense that they were going to do it. So from a U.S. policy perspective, as we heard initially, very similar to this, there were initial rumblings, and then there was sort of a meeting, and then like a secret agreement about Djibouti. We thought, okay, when we step back, what is it that we're going to be able to sort of compete properly with China on and maybe prevent them from doing? And then what are things that are sort of going to happen anyway, and maybe we should just be able to shape what they are. So a lot of similarities here. One stark difference being it's not 2,000 kilometers away from either of our countries, right? Djibouti is, you know, is much further away, so whatever happened there would be distant. So that is a question there. So really, to me, the fact that it's the Solomon Islands we're discussing today, and if you remember, it was 4 years ago, there was a quick press cycle on Vanuatu. Right, Amanda, on whether or not there was a discussion between China and Vanuatu, which Vanuatu denied, and there's been no evidence otherwise. I'm just stating that there have been, you know, there's history here of this popping up again. And so island nations are watching because they say, okay, well, we don't know who's going to dominate, you know, the Pacific in 10 or 20 years. And if I were advising any island nation's government right now, I would say, well, it's really hard to choose. How can you sort of play, I would say play is not the best term, but to be able to work toward the national interests of your country by engaging with both China and the United States and Australia right now.
There is a high level of concern. Some commentators say too high level of fear and concern about what Beijing plans in the Pacific. And then we have the comments from the Defence Minister Dutton on Monday saying we've got to be ready for war. And the Prime Minister saying this about the red line, that if they cross the red line, something will happen, but we're not sure what.
Right.
Is it clear to you what would happen if this red line was crossed?
No, and as an alumnus of the Obama administration, and we self-critique and look in the mirror, when we established a red line for chemical weapons that was relatively ignored by policy afterwards, you recognize that it's a really difficult term to use, and I wouldn't have advised it.
And you're referring to Obama saying there's a red line, anyone uses chemical weapons in Syria and watch out, and they use chemical weapons and nothing much happens.
Exactly. It's why it's a term that's fraught. But the Prime Minister went further, and he actually stated that not only do we share this red line with the United States, which is bold to speak for the United States, but he also said that simply because Prime Minister Segevare said that we're not going to have a military base here, that he was also saying so clearly he shares the same red line. So there are a lot of problems with that. Now, I understand it's an election cycle, not my expertise, but the words that are used there would ultimately state that if China moved forward toward a military presence, it begs the question of what would that, what action would be the counteraction.
We also saw, David, a reaction from Chinese military expert Zhao Bo. Now, he was a colonel in the People's Liberation Army. So presumably he's not just chatting to the ABC's China Tonight for no reason, but have a listen to what he said.
Let me reiterate again, as my government has said that China has no intention whatsoever to establish a military base in Solomon Islands. Besides, we too are sovereign states, and we certainly are fully entitled to have whatever cooperation we want. So this has nothing to do with Australia. I don't believe the Australian government is in any capacity to lay such things like a red line for China. It is ridiculous. It is laughable for me.
David?
Yeah. Well, I think those sorts of comments have to be taken with a huge grain of salt. You know, the Chinese gave a commitment to President Obama that they wouldn't be building up the reefs in the South China Sea, but they went straight ahead and did it. And so what you're seeing in the Solomons, I think it's been a wake-up call for Australia. But if you look further abroad or around the region, and just been talking about Djibouti, but there's a number of other countries where the Chinese have gone in there, and there's a bit of a pattern of behaviour through a number of African countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Laos, quite a few, where the Chinese go in a pretty low-key way, offer some low-cost capital, usually investment, maybe some personnel and skills. Before too long, that country finds itself in a bit of financial trouble. Suddenly the Chinese government's got its hooks into them. Often these are characterised with secret agreements, not just the terms and conditions of the agreement, but the existence of the agreement as well.
Indeed, and what's the benefit then of Canberra saying there's a red line, and that is naval bases by the Chinese, and not being able to say what would happen afterwards?
Yeah, look, I think what we just heard about Obama's red line was absolutely true. It cost the US a lot in credibility to come out with something like that. I think what has to happen from here, frankly, is there's been clearly a lot of kind of leaders' meetings over the issue, but the deal's gone ahead anyway. But what you have in the Solomon Islands, it seems, is that there's very great public unhappiness with the deal, with the sidling up to China, being in hock to them, all of that sort of thing. There was an opinion poll run in the Solomon Islands, reports of an opinion poll that said 90% of people would prefer to align with Liberal Democrat countries. Only 9% wanted to align with China. Now, you take that as a base and you've got enormous potential to win the hearts and minds of normal Solomon Islanders who don't want to be part of an authoritarian regime's sphere of influence. They don't want to be a client state. So I think there's opportunity for Australia in concert with other Pacific Island countries to make a direct appeal on the ground to Solomon Islanders, talking about the dangers of this agreement.
Okay, let me bounce back to Amanda on that. Do you think that that would be receptive from what you understand of the Solomon Islands? And additionally, do you think Labor's approach of offering green cards so 3,000 Pacific migrants can come a year as opposed to the 700 who came last year, offering to essentially say the guest workers in this country who pick fruit will pretty much exclusively come from the Pacific Islands in future? Do you think all and any of that helps?
Look, I think that any step towards offering some economic security to a group of people who are facing existential crisis, who don't even know whether they'll have a home in 20 years' time, is going to be helpful. So I think that the residency offer is something that's a little bit more attractive. I still think that we need to be looking, if we're going to genuinely partner with the Pacific, that we have to, A, ask what you need, secondly, to work alongside and build trust to create that. In terms of the amount of, the split amongst the community, yeah, there's clearly a split around whether or not who to trust, really. I mean, there has been there are vulnerabilities about being small island nation states. There are challenges that we have to face in the reality of how we're going to move in this world. And we have really significant players who are now wanting to talk to us. But up until recently, almost none of them were. So I think any moves that are about offering a future and a vision and a hope to Solomon Islanders, to Vanuatuans, from people anywhere across the Pacific, to say, we are here for you and we are going to work towards your great need, and that is to reduce our emissions, to save your lands, to work alongside with you, will land far more effectively than any sort of split propaganda. We've seen so much example of the West coming in and trying to do propaganda around, come with us, work with us, don't go with China. That's throughout history. It's been a dismal failure. That's not how you build trust. That's not how you build relationships.
We're nearly out of time, Fiona, and I do want to go back to Jason. So just really quickly, the farming sector has been concerned about what Labor would do, which is sort of dial down the ag visas that you fought for so hard, and basically said, look, let's give all of this work pretty much to the Pacific Islanders. What is wrong with that?
Oh, well, we absolutely believe in the Pacific, the Pacific people coming. Look, it sounds really great that some of them are going to, there's an existing scheme. We've always said it's really valuable and we need to look at expanding that and working with that scheme and talking to these people about what's important to them as opposed to talking at them, which is sometimes what happens.
What's the difference between someone coming from Vanuatu or someone coming from Vietnam?
Well, the thing is that there's just not enough people from those Pacific Islands to actually satisfy our needs. Well, there wasn't before COVID.
But I mean, Labor says that no one's come in much under these ag visas.
Well, no,
so that's not been true.
Well, they haven't. They haven't.
Can I just ask Fiona a question? Fiona, would you be prepared for your industry to pay wages, the same wages, award wages, like everybody else who's in business? People from the Pacific?
And we do, and we are. And this is the thing, unfortunately, at the moment, some of the wages, because of the supply and demand factors, some of the wages that people are receiving on farms are extraordinary. They're very, very high. And absolutely we want to do that. But we also have to have an assurance of supply of people coming in. And that was the problem before COVID. And that's, been the problem since. So now that we've done all this work, can we please keep doing it so that we can have that assurance and that can then, we can go forward with that.
We've only got about a minute left, Jason. This is being posited by Labor and by some commentators as a major foreign policy failure for Australia. Do you, in terms of allowing Beijing to get a foothold in Honiara, do you see it that way?
I disagree. What this is a symptom of, and quite frankly, as the US and the US policies official, of us being able to give countries, and it's a long list, it's not just Pacific Island nations, it's Indonesia, it's Vietnam, it's Singapore, it's other countries that are looking between the US and China and trying to decide what to choose. We have not provided those countries a credible alternative to China. And the Solomon Islands, what we're seeing in the last couple of days is a symptom of that. If you look at the long list of promises that the U.S. made when Campbell and Crittenbrink, who just visited this past week, provided, they did ask Solomon Islands what they want, and there is a long list. But the question is, who's next? And the question is what is the overall alternative and trajectory of these policies?
And that's not a failure by Australia, as often I'm going to get screamed at, but seen as the deputy sheriff in this region that we've let down Washington. Noreen's rolling her eyes.
Well, listen, if you frame the question as did Solomon Islands immediately shut the door on China and that's success or failure, then it is failure. But that's too high of a bar. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that we can actually expect of countries in the region right now when they don't know what the future holds?
Wonderful discussion. Thanks all for that. My thanks to Fiona Simpson, to Noreen Young, David Alexander, please come back, and Amanda Young, and to our guest, Jason Israel. Jules is back with you tomorrow night. Have a great evening. Good night to you.
It's such a scary thing, feeling like you're not in control of your mind. I would put myself in the fetal position. It was terrifying.
In a unique social experiment, 7 strangers will expose their deepest fears.
It takes a lot to come out and talk about mental health.
Can art and creativity heal invisible wounds? Hosted by Natalie Bassingthwaite. With some of Australia's best-known artists.
All will be revealed.
Space 22 starts May 17 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
WA businesses brace for a busy weekend with the scrapping of masks and crowd limits. The election campaign shifts focus to the cost of living and the economy as the government insists it's not to blame for the rate of inflation. Australia among 40 countries to send more weapons to Ukraine.
Coming up on The Business, consumers hit with the highest prices in 20 years. Inflation gallops over 5%, putting an election rate rise on the cards.
This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Pamela Medlin. WA businesses are preparing for a busy weekend with the state's mask mandate and capacity limits to be scrapped on Friday. But the Premier has revealed COVID vaccine mandates for the workforce will not be relaxed until well past 80% of the population is triple dosed.
It's the change this Perth brewery has been desperately waiting for. No capacity limits, no proof of vaccination, and no masks.
We can talk to customers better. We can see each other's facial expressions and see each other's smiles, which we couldn't do before. So it's got to make hospitality more hospitality.
Brad Hill had 4 venues about to open when COVID hit. All had to be shelved. His smaller venues were closed permanently.
It's really hard, really stressful. You know, I'm pretty sure I started COVID with dark hair and look at it now.
His brewery was filled with people before Omicron hit over summer, and then revenue dropped by 90% in just weeks. He hopes no restrictions and growing community confidence will see it full again soon.
For this venue, scrapping that 2 square metre rule takes it from 500 people back to 1,000, and hopefully back to turning a profit.
A stone's throw from the CBD, the brewery shares the government's hopes people will start returning to near-empty office buildings.
Look, there is a psychological challenge here. People have been used to working from home.
To meet that challenge, the government's pledged $7 million to refurbish Yagan Square and fund events in the city.
This state government is doing everything we can. We need the big firms in town to make it very clear to get their workers back into the city.
The opposition says the ongoing state of emergency means public anxiety is understandable.
Living under a state of emergency, as we have currently, with no light at the end of the tunnel, is confusing and flummoxing for people in the community.
But there's a lot of moving parts, and we certainly believe that we need this for a bit longer, just to make sure that we've got all the powers we need.
Also going nowhere soon are the workplace vaccination mandates. Minister McTiernan says worker absences still pose a serious threat to important supply chains. The mandate is set to be in place until well over 80% of WA's population is triple vaxxed.
At least for the over the coming months.
The triple dose rate is currently 79%.
That's really nice. Excellent.
James Carmody, ABC News.
Inflation has surged to 5.1%, the highest level in more than 2 decades. An interest rate hike is now likely to come as soon as next week. It will be the first time rates have gone up during a federal campaign for 15 years. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
If you can't control the prices, try to show you care.
We're all friends here.
Scott Morrison attempting to spin bad news into a favourable comparison with other nations struggling with high inflation.
But there's Australia, performing better than all of them when it comes to cost of living pressures.
But two can play at that game.
Real wages are going backwards in this country, more substantially than they are in the US.
An overheating economy delivering a nasty political curveball. one that goes straight to Labor's central pitch.
Everything is going up except people's pay, and they're about to be hit with rising interest rates on top of all of that.
Australia is not immune from the international pressures driving up inflation.
Labor's economic team revealing its budget strategy and a plan to raise $5 billion over the next 4 years that includes slashing government use of contractors, consultants and labour hire, a waste audit to identify savings and a crackdown on tax evasion by multinationals and those working across borders, including 600 Australian firms, mostly in technology, construction, financing and mining.
Tax havens are the hidey holes for ill-gotten gains.
Labor to use the revenue to reinvest in improved services, a bolstered public service and paying off some of the trillion-dollar debt.
If we're successful in May, we will inherit the worst set of budget books of any incoming government.
There's one certainty, whoever wins on May 21, interest rates are about to surge. And with inflation well above expectations, this could start as early as next week when the Reserve Bank meets. The last time rates increased during an election campaign was on Melbourne Cup Day in 2007, 2 weeks before voters dispatched John Howard as Prime Minister, a record Scott Morrison won't want to repeat. But some things never change.
What Labor has is a tax, a sneaky carbon tax.
This bloke is so out of touch you'd need the Hubble telescope to find him.
The PM reheating an old scare campaign on climate to deflect from National Senator Matt Canavan's crusade against net zero emissions. His leader insisting there's nothing to see.
2050, we've made an agreement. We're going to honour that agreement.
Does he need to pull his head in?
Yeah, pull your head in, Matt.
The great thing about the Nationals Party is we tell everybody in the public what we say in private.
If that's the best thing, what on earth is the worst? Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
One of Scott Morrison's most senior ministers has suggested that China attempted to disrupt the coalition's election campaign with its announcement of a security pact with Solomon Islands. Labor has scoffed at the claim by Karen Andrews, calling on the Home Affairs Minister to back up the claim with evidence. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts.
The campaign trail has predictable rhythms.
What are we doing up here? Can we have a look up here?
But China's announcement of its Solomon Islands security deal was a powerful disruptive force. Australian intelligence chiefs say China's spent a decade striving for the security pact.
This strategy has been unfolding for a number of years.
But one of Scott Morrison's frontbenchers is hinting the timing was no coincidence.
I think the one thing that we should be at least taking notice of and paying some attention to is the timing.
Karen Andrews effectively asserting Beijing deliberately dropped the announcement in the election's second week in order to cruel the coalition's chances.
Why now? Why right in the middle of a federal election campaign? I mean, we talk about political interference and that has many forms.
She hasn't backed the claim with evidence, and if the minister's seen intelligence supporting the allegation, she isn't sharing it.
I thought what Karen Andrews said was remarkably desperate and remarkably unhinged.
The West is putting lots of weight in promises delivered by Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare.
He vowed publicly as well as privately that there would be no Chinese military base.
But there's fear even a Chinese police presence could be deeply disruptive.
Chinese policing techniques and tactics that we've seen deployed so ruthlessly in Hong Kong, for example, are completely inconsistent with the Pacific way.
Karen Andrews' suggestion isn't totally implausible. After all, China is capable of sophisticated interference campaigns. But officials say in this case, Beijing was probably just racing to finalise the agreement as quickly as possible. And it would see the convergence with Australia's election as a happy coincidence. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Canberra.
The international community, including Australia, has committed new weapons to Ukraine. Russia has turned off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria, threatening to target more countries it calls unfriendly. And in a meeting with the UN Secretary-General in Moscow, the Russian president again denied his troops are committing atrocities in Ukraine. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from Bucha.
A statue symbolising friendship between Russia and Ukraine is torn down in Kiev. It's the first of 60 monuments from the Soviet era that will be removed from the capital. Russia's military is creating havoc in the south and the east. Moscow says it's fired 1,300 missiles into Ukraine since the start of the war. Ukrainian troops are fighting back, but their supplies are limited. The US has marshalled 40 countries, including Australia, to send more weapons to Ukraine. In a major policy reversal, Germany has announced it will send dozens of anti-aircraft tanks. Vladimir Putin used his infamous long table for his meeting with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who went to Moscow to plead for peace. They agreed in principle for the UN to be involved in evacuating civilians from Mariupol. But the Russian president denied his soldiers are committing atrocities, despite the evidence. And he repeated his claim the invasion of Ukraine was justified.
I say once again, these were desperate measures to stop the suffering of people living in those territories. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues chose to ignore that.
But people here in Bucha saw the horrors with their own eyes. The bodies have been exhumed from mass graves, but the identification process can be a long one, especially if there's no family around to help.
Medical examiners here say people's causes of death are varied. Some people were shot, others died from explosions or shrapnel injuries. It seems some may have starved to death while they were hiding from the Russians. And then there were those who simply didn't have access to medical care.
Inna Pentkivska and her cousin Yulia have come to collect the body of Inna's ex-husband, Vladislav. He was shot in the doorway.
Nobody can believe that this would happen in the 21st century. We can't believe it. The Russian soldiers were barbaric.
They're taking Vladislav's body away to give the 43-year-old a proper burial. A war crimes investigation is already underway, but it could take years before people here get anything close to justice. Nick Dole, ABC News, Bucha.
The owner of a Perth bar has been given a 7-month suspended jail term for hosting a New Year's Eve party in breach of strict COVID rules. Vinod Paraha is the owner of the George Bar in the CBD, where hundreds of partygoers were seen by police not wearing masks, dancing and drinking standing up, all of which were banned at the time. The event was shut down just before midnight by police who had to scale a gate to get inside because the doors were locked and windows blacked out. The Chief Magistrate accepted that Paraha didn't organise the party but said he permitted it to happen at a time when other New Year's Eve events were cancelled. Fremantle will be without Matt Taberner for Saturday's clash with Geelong after the forward suffered a hamstring injury during the win over Carlton. It means the Dockers will be missing 2 key tools for the trip to Cardinia Park, with Sean Darcy out with concussion.
It's the hardest trip in football, and Fremantle will have to brave Cardinia Park without 2 key tools. Sean Darcy already out with concussion, and now Matt Taberner sidelined.
Yeah, he's going to miss this week with a hamstring strain. We're just going to put him in doubt, for the week after as well, given we're only on a 6-day break the following week. So, it's unfortunate. He's clearly building into some good form.
It appears Josh Tracy will get the nod after 4 goals in the WAFL, with highly regarded draftee Jai Amos needing more time to develop despite an impressive 5 goals for Peel Thunder.
I want to see him put a good body of work together before he's available for selection. He's missed a lot of pre-season. He's still not quite there with his fitness.
Hayden Young and Heath Chapman could also come into the side after missing the win over the Blues with COVID. Darcy Tucker and James H were both missing from training. Fremantle has lost 6 of its last 7 against Geelong, including a 133-point thrashing on its last trip to Cardinia Park.
Parfitt will go into the goal, and there's number 15.
The Dockers battling to match the experienced Cats.
It comes back to pretty important parts of our game, and that's contest. And our pressure hasn't been at the level it needs to be against Geelong. I think they've been too big and too strong for us.
Fremantle will name its final team on Thursday. Tom Wildey, ABC News.
Taking a look around the country, cloudy in Melbourne, mostly sunny for Adelaide, a possible storm in Darwin and showers for the remaining capital cities. And that's ABC Late News. I'm Pamela Medlin. Thanks for your company this evening. Stay with us for The Business. Good night.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, harvesting the highest prices in 20 years. Inflation gallops over 5%, putting an election rate rise on the cards.
I mean, we will be short, for sure. I think you'll find that everybody's going to have to put the prices up.
And prices are on the march, so why aren't pay packets when workers can expect a national pay rise?
Real wages are definitely a problem. They're not going forward. They're at best they will stagnate. Probably they'll go backwards.
Economists were bracing for a big number, but the latest inflation reading smashed expectations. The cost of living surged by 5.1% over the past year, the fastest pace since the Howard government introduced the GST. And that puts the Reserve Bank under pressure to raise rates for the first time in 11 years, all in the middle of an election campaign. Rachel Papazzoni has the story.
Steve Hall's costs are soaring and he's contemplating when to pass some of them on to his customers.
So everything is increasing, nothing certainly decreases. Barrels have gone up from $1,200 each to $1,800 each. So everything has gone up.
Steve's paying more to keep his staff, his equipment and fuel costs are up, and ingredients and additives are also more expensive, which means each glass of wine is costing him more to make, while his customers have been paying the same price for 2 years.
I mean, we will be short, for sure. I think you'll find that everybody's going to have to put the prices up. In about a year's time, we might have to put the prices up.
In the first 3 months of the year, consumer prices rose 2.1%, taking annual inflation to 5.1%. That's the biggest jump since the GST was introduced. In the quarter, the cost of building new homes increased almost 6%. Fuel was up 11%, though that will come down next quarter thanks to the excise cut. And it's getting more expensive to eat. Vegetables, fruit and beef are all costing a lot more at the checkout.
And that really matters because if we're thinking about which type of households are more or less impacted by this kind of inflationary environment, it's typically those on a lower income. They have to spend a higher proportion of their wages or their other sources of income on those essential items.
Economist Sarah Hunter says we may be nearing the peak of inflation, but higher prices will be here for some time to come.
I think that's something that we're going to continue to see, certainly through the rest of this year. And it's only really once we get into 2023 and even beyond that that we'll see, I expect inflation start to really fall back down into that 2% to 3% band.
New mum Sophie Miller is all too aware of her rising food bill.
Groceries in particular is making a huge impact. Something that might have cost, $10 last year is costing $20, and eating healthy as well is becoming even more difficult because fresh fruit and veg is so expensive.
Annual core inflation, which strips out one-off price rises, is 3.7%, well above the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target range. That's pushed some economists to forecast the RBA will lift the official interest rate on Tuesday. But the nation's biggest lender says whether it's next week or next month doesn't really matter.
At the end of the day, whether they move in May or June is sort of semantics as far as the impact on the economy goes. It's only 1 month. And I think based on what they've set up until this point, it makes a lot of sense for them to hold out and move in June.
Gareth Aird thinks the rate hikes will be slow and steady, reaching 1% by the end of the year.
I think they need to deliver a shallow tightening cycle Otherwise, they'll choke off, I think, the wages growth and the strong economy that they've so long desired.
Something that can't be ignored in a cost of living election campaign.
Today's higher inflation numbers are a reminder to Australians that we are living in a complex and volatile economic environment.
Everything is going up except people's pay, and they're about to be hit with rising interest rates on top of all of that.
Sophie is worried about her mortgage repayments.
It's really scary because interest rates have been so good for such a long time. It would make a really big impact if we had to increase our mortgage payments every month. You know, that's our biggest expense by a landslide at the moment.
Rates are going up, just like the cost of living.
Rachel Papazzoni there. Well, inflation is on the march and rates are set to follow. Sue Lannon looks back at the long road to rising prices.
It's the pandemic nobody saw coming. Lockdowns and restrictions brought the global economy to a standstill. Initially, prices plunged as worried consumers stopped spending. Governments and central banks pumped trillions and trillions of dollars into their economies, slashing interest rates to record lows to stave off a predicted recession. Here, the Reserve Bank cut rates to near zero, pumping $350 billion into the economy buying government bonds. But government home building subsidies and the cheapest money on record saw prices start to turn. House prices and construction costs soared. All the stimulus and working from home boosted demand for things like furniture, computers and home entertainment. Disrupted global supply chains, especially shipping, couldn't keep up. It didn't help when one of the world's biggest container ships blocked the vital Suez Canal. Russia's invasion of Ukraine exacerbated energy prices, also hitting metals and grains. Crude oil jumped above $100 a barrel, pushing up petrol and transport costs here. And shoppers have been hit at the supermarket as devastating floods push prices for fruit and veg. All this with the RBA set to pull the trigger on the first rate rise in 11 years.
Inflation has a 5 in front of it, but for many workers, wages would be lucky to have it too. Red-hot prices are not being matched by national pay rises, with real wages going backwards. I spoke earlier with EY's Sherelle Murphy. Sherelle, you say that the RBA must raise rates in May or lose credibility. Will we see an election rate rise?
I think it seems very likely. The number today, the CPI number, was higher than the market expected. It showed that inflation was broad-based across the economy, and it's not just coming from international factors. There's many domestic reasons why inflation is high. I think given all that, and given that the trajectory for inflation still looks quite strong, the Reserve Bank needs to get on with it and raise rates.
So, Sherelle, is it inevitable that real wages will now go backwards with CPI over 5%?
Well, if we don't get wages to grow at the same rate or more than inflation, then by definition they do, and it seems unlikely that we'll see a wage number of 5% or more. So yes, in the short term, it does seem like we will see that, and we actually have seen that in the recent past too. So yes, real wages are definitely a problem. They're not going forward. At best, they will stagnate. Probably they'll go backwards.
So we've got an extremely tight labour market, as we know, as we've been reporting. Therefore, why aren't we seeing wage increases?
Well, I think we are seeing wage increases. It's just that they're not particularly strong. And of course, we've got to really wait for that data, that wage price index, to get a better feel for what's happened in that very strong quarter, which was the March quarter, to get a proper read. I'd be very surprised if we didn't see some good numbers there. It's just that they probably won't be 5% or more. So we'll be watching really closely to see what happens there. There are definitely pockets that we've heard of through our clients where their wage growth is much higher than 5%. It's just that across the economy as a whole, not quite there yet.
It's interesting because everyone seems to be in furious agreement that we need wages to grow, but it seems that not everyone wants to hand out a pay rise. How do you address or break this nexus?
Well, I mean, ultimately the economy breaks it in the sense that if you can't get enough workers to do the work that you have to do to earn your profits, you've got to pay more. And that's essentially, I think, what we're seeing at the moment. Now, we see that more in the I guess, the segments of the economy where economic activity is higher, so they're the ones actually paying higher wages. What we need is that to filter through. There is, of course, the governments themselves, though. These are also employers, and we've had wage freezes on state government employees for some time. Now, they've started to be dropped now, but, you know, clearly there is a case here for not only those to be dropped, but perhaps a little bit more on the government side too.
So there's a couple of options to boost wages, but what else do you think should be looked at? Should there be government policies to boost productivity? Should the Fair Work Commission be pushing up the minimum wage? I mean, where will it come from? Is it a multitude of these factors?
It is a multitude of factors. Ultimately, what we really want to see is productivity growth in the economy, because that's what legitimately pushes wages higher. That's when employers don't mind paying higher wages, because they're getting more output per worker. So really, that's what we want to do. Now, of course, that's easy to say. It's not always easy to do. And particularly in an economy that's been affected by COVID, as ours has, where we're sort of seeing, you know, people shifting around and reassessing, and different industries growing and others contracting. I guess the dust is still settling from that. But look, productivity is what it's all about. That's where we get real wage growth. That's where we do things better than the rest of the world, and that's what justifies stronger wages than you might get in any other country, and that's where we'll lift the national numbers.
So, Sherelle, the next wages number is out May 18. What are you expecting, and what sort of wage rises do you think we'll see, in which sectors and when?
So across the economy, we will see, I think, strong wage rises in those industries that are clearly doing better. Now, we will likely see the miners and the resource companies pick their wages up probably before others. Equally, there are parts of agriculture that are doing well. We might see a little bit there. It's always really a reflection of what are the sectors that are going through strongly. So we think about it, we've got mining, we've got agriculture. Clearly, we've got construction, another sector which is in really hot demand right now. I'd expect to see wages go up there more than any other sector.
Sherelle Murphy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To the markets, and the All Ordinaries in the ASX 200 were down for a third session. The Australian dollar is slightly higher after those inflation numbers. I spoke to Martin Lakos from Macquarie after the market closed. Martin, the highest inflation number since 2000. How did the markets react?
Kath, certainly, you know, this global phenomenon of inflation rising is impacting global markets all around, and our market obviously gets caught up in that. Of course, what's interesting from that inflation data is that from a breadth perspective, that is the number of components of inflation is the largest or the strongest impact for households since the last quarter of 1990. Interestingly, the share market, we closed down about 56 points. The immediate impact was, having been down 20, we were down an additional 30 and then recovered all of that. So again, a bit of volatility for investors in our market. Interestingly, from yesterday's big sell-off in the resources side, we saw resources actually rally somewhat. BHP up about 0.7%. But given those inflationary impacts, no surprise that household discretionary and consumer staples were all weaker today. Energy also rebounded along with the rest of resources. And we also saw healthcare pretty stable.
Well, Martin, the pressure is on the RBA for a mid-election rate rise. What are you tipping?
Well, Macquarie's still of the view that the Reserve Bank will raise rates in June, not in May. But there's no doubt that this data is going to prompt the Reserve Bank to act sooner. Equally so, we have raised our expectation of the extent by which the Reserve Bank will raise rates. So we think there's 40 basis points coming in June and another 25 basis points in July, taking the cash rate to 0.75. We think that will continue up towards 2.25% by June of next year. That's that's where we think rates will probably peak. But of course, we have to see what transitory elements in this inflation data will start to come out of those numbers in the next 6 to 9 months. So markets are going to be focused on that. Interestingly enough, Kath, the bond markets had an interesting reaction. 10-year yields actually came off a little bit, but no surprise, short-term rates continue to rise in anticipation of the Reserve Bank making a move on the cash rate. OK,
and tech stocks have taken another beating. What's worrying investors?
Well, certainly we saw tech stocks peak in November of last year with the Nasdaq at 16,200, now at 12,500 index points. That's down 23%. In November, there's no doubt that tech stocks globally were getting overvalued. But of course, tech stocks are also very much leveraged to global growth. And as it does appear that global growth is slowing, the tech stocks are being hit on the back of that.
Martin Lakos, thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Kath.
And that's all from The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. See you next time.
I am a 94-year-old and still singing every day. When I come to Australia, I couldn't speak English at all. Not one word. The most important thing for me to make me happy is my family, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and my garden. I think working in a garden is always essential for me because I grew up on a farm in Italy, and that's why I love it. I think that be around with my grandchildren is the most important thing to my heart, that I love them. I say to the young people, work out what you love to do and do it. I'm Biase Michele. I'm proud to be 94 years young. La dolce vita, the sweet life.
Sunday as the dust settles on a messy first week of campaigning.
Well, it hasn't been dull, has it? We're 1 week down and 5 to go in the campaign.
Campaigning back on in earnest. Back on the trail today.
Hi, Oscar.
Oh, you know me, I'm sweet as.
The first week of the campaign has revealed the vulnerabilities of both leaders. Good Friday should have brought a welcome reprieve.
The two leaders have launched dueling scare campaigns.
Anne Ruston has made it very clear she wants to take the universal out of universal health care.
Labor have learned nothing when it comes to border protection. The helm has no place for the inexperienced.
A rare unscripted appearance.
The first time he's mingled with large crowds this campaign.
Anthony Albanese got a less than warm welcome when he took to the stage
after receiving a mixed reception at the Byron Bay Blues Festival last night. Scott Morrison has found himself in hot water with members of his own party. The Prime Minister is standing by his candidate for Warringah. Handpicked by Scott Morrison. The comments by Catherine Deves have been described as hurtful to members of the transgender community.
The captain. She's the captain's pick and you're the captain.
Yeah, no, I'm not joining that pile-on.
If I was Scott Morrison, I wouldn't have selected her in the first place.
In the last election, political parties right across the spectrum had candidates dropping out like flies because social media was coming back to haunt them. In this campaign again, we have seen Scott Morrison's hand-picked candidate in Warringah have more posts come out by the day, creating this question about why is Catherine Deves still the Liberal candidate?
I don't think Catherine Deves is there to win Warringah for the Liberals. She's there as Scott Morrison's vanguard in his freedom train. She's the one who's championing his fight against political correctness. That's what's going on here. She's more a device than a candidate.
Do you think they're sacrificing the prospect of winning Warringah in order to shore up support in other New South Wales seat where that kind of message is more palatable?
I think that's a grand curiosity here, Mel, because it is possible that in championing the vote of the outer suburban Australian, he might actually be risking North Sydney, Wentworth. That is a curiosity that's shared within the Liberal Party and the Labor Party.
I think we've seen for a while now the Labor Party having to confront this issue of
quite a wide range of diversity of views within its supporter base, and I think the Liberal Party is now starting to confront that problem.
And I think it goes beyond trans kids with the Catherine Deves situation. It represents something else that Scott Morrison seems to be picking up. Is it the new Quiet Australians phenomenon?
We heard a lot about Christian behaviour during the Easter weekend period. It does make me wonder, how Christian is it to be persecuting some of our most vulnerable kids in the community? About 1 in 2, 48% of kids between 14 and 25 who are trans youths will attempt suicide during that age bracket.
Scott Morrison will start week 2 of the election campaign on the ground in Western Australia.
The Prime Minister is on a blitz through WA, spending another consecutive day in Western Australia as he faces a battle to retain coalition seats.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
And how good is this team?
The Prime Minister has headed west for the first time this election campaign, and we're here at a small but pretty loud launch for the Liberals here. We've got a number of sitting MPs, we've also got some senators and candidates too. The importance of WA pretty high on Scott Morrison's agenda this time round.
Yeah, I think it just goes to show the sort of energy we just saw inside that event, a bit of a morale boost in some of those electorates that are really going to be key.
There was that local announcement for a BMX club. What do we know about these local grants and the money during election campaigns, the importance of them even?
Yeah, it's become a bit of a pattern, hasn't it? The sort of bigger picture, doorstop in the morning, and then going to these local events and very local and targeted funding announcements just goes to show how important those seats are going to be. And of course, it has that history of, you know, these allegations of pork barrelling and sports rights.
It's about you. It's about your ambition. It's about your aspiration.
Prime Minister at the end there saying this election is about you. It's about you trying to buy a home. It's about your kids. It's about your local sporting club. So economy at a broad scale, but then once again bringing it down to the individual.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that stood out for me of how localised it is in WA is something that we're going to hear over and over again over the next few weeks. Scott Morrison saying that a vote for Scott Morrison doesn't change who the Premier is.
My opponent is running on fear and scare.
If he wants to talk about trust and integrity, then he should show some today.
Complete and utter rubbish.
The election campaign turned nasty today.
Both leaders trashing each other's policies and slinging personal insults.
Each accusing the other of concocting lies to smear their opponent.
Stop frightening pensioners.
The bin fire of lies.
Well, it was a little over a week ago we were hearing about how optimistic and positive Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison were for the country, but a little bit after a week in and grannies getting put on the cashless welfare card, your power bills going up, Medicare's being privatised, the boats are coming, it's starting to look a lot more negative than we were seeing at the start.
Look, often we see these negative scare campaigns play out, particularly late in a campaign. It's amazing how early in this very long campaign it's gotten negative and dirty. These scare campaigns really accelerate on social media. And for a lot of people who are disengaged with politics, aren't following mainstream media where these sorts of blatant lies are effectively curated out or at least explained, they proliferate so much more now on social media.
Sadly, being negative works to some degree. The great risk for Labor and the coalition is that when they have something that is true that they really want to talk about, the public trust is so eroded that perhaps no one will believe anything anyone says.
I find it really strange that even where there are very real and meaningful policy differences, the scare campaigns are overshadowing them. It's strange that the fake campaign of smear and scare is winning out over an actually very important policy
And a
debate.
lot of campaigns that we won't see because they'll be very targeted in where they're delivering them via social media, so that it's only someone in that age bracket that might well be seeing this campaign.
Anthony Albanese's sticking it out in Queensland, where his party's aiming to lift its stocks above the half a dozen seats held at the moment.
How does he go?
Badly.
So Tom, you've been on the campaign with Anthony Albanese for 10 days now. Have you felt that he's managed to recover since that day one blunder?
It took him a few days to shake it off, to use his phrase. I think he has done well. There's a bit more spirit in Labor today. The past couple of days have been falling back on key policy areas like health that Labor wants to talk about, and you can see there's been a shake-up behind the scenes, better advice, sharper attack lines on the government. I think he's getting a bit of mojo. They'll be trying to avoid mistakes like that going forward.
Yeah, you could definitely tell today that there seems to be a shift in his demeanour at press conferences. He was really quite assertive, definitely fired up on the issue of aged care. I felt that was quite a stark contrast to the day one press conference.
Workers are leaving the sector.
Anthony Albanese's team has spent 5 days in Queensland. For me, I feel that that's an indication that Labor thinks if it's going to win seats, it might be around the southeast of the state.
I think that is the rationale. I think key states like Queensland and WA will respond to the leaders being here and being in local media and being seen around the traps. I'm not sure Anthony Albanese has cut through that much with Queenslanders. There have been local announcements, but how many people know he's in Queensland, I'm not sure. I think they want to make up ground that Bill Shorten lost in 2019. I think the floods might help in some of the inner city Brisbane seats. It'll be fascinating to see.
The first must-watch election debate of the campaign.
100 undecided voters in the room in Brisbane asking what they want, how they want.
No, you were not proposing.
I'm sorry, it was our policy.
You were not
Turn back to our policy.
No,
That's not what's happening, and I was very clear about this today.
Well, you said you'd introduce the legislation.
No, but it's always the Liberals and Nationals have to work out how to pay for
Scott is very critical of the ICAC.
No, we haven't changed our position, Anthony.
It wasn't so much rumble in the jungle, but we finally got a chance to see Albanese and Morrison go toe-to-toe. What did we learn from it?
Not much, Brett. Election debates are things where you can lose a lot and gain very little, to be honest. You might have a spanking performance with an election debate and...
Well, Bill Shorten won 3 of them.
But if you make an absolute arse of yourself, it's replayed for days, if not weeks. So it can have an influence.
I think election debates, their benefit is more secondary. How many votes are you actually going to persuade as a result of that debate? Probably very few. But if Anthony Albanese walks away from this debate going, yep, I think I nailed it, I think I did a good job, he's more likely to feel he has a bit of momentum, have a bit of a positive attitude, G's up his supporters, they all start to feel more positive, and that might lead to a better performance for them for the next couple of weeks.
The timing helps Anthony Albanese. It's someone who wanted the Easter break to reset, to put the first week well and truly behind him, to come out and stand side by side with the Prime Minister to show to the Australian public, yes, I can be the Prime Minister that I think you're looking for.
He was the one who used Scott Morrison's first name, called him Scott. The Prime Minister took a few moments to realise that was being played upon him. Anthony Albanese put in a pretty good performance. I thought there was a bit of a stumble on boat turnbacks, which has been a real issue and a thorn in the side, both for the Labor Party as a whole, but especially the left rump of the Labor Party, in which he's a senior figure.
I think for the average person watching, they want to get a vibe. They want to get a sense that, yes, I can imagine Anthony Albanese as being calm and in control and in command of the facts, or have it reinforced for them, oh yes, Scott Morrison, I do think he's reminding me of the good things that are going on. The average viewer is going to take a much broader view rather than the specific details perhaps that we end up cogitating over.
Why would you take China's side?
That's an outrageous slur.
The campaign took a sharp turn into foreign policy today.
A new security deal now signed between the Solomon Islands and China.
This represents the worst failure for Australian foreign policy in the Pacific since the end of World War II.
Our Foreign Minister should be on the next plane to Solomon Islands to talk with the government.
Why was Maurice Payne not sent to the Solomon Islands the minute the government knew that this deal was coming to a head? And is it a failure of your Pacific Step-Up program?
No, I think, no, absolutely not.
I think there's 2 ways you could look at the debate over China about whether it's good or bad for Scott Morrison. On one side, it's a bad position for Scott Morrison to be in now because he has thumped his chest and said, I am the one who can deal with China. This is a serious problem. I'm the one in the world standing up to Xi Jinping. But I think there's an alternative way we can look at this as well, and that is that Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party have been trying to convince the public that China is a real threat. Finally, he's got some evidence to show, yes, there is a threat, here's an actual move. So perhaps it reinforces his message that these are uncertain times. So there's a possibility as well it could work in his favour.
I think you're right, Mel.
But
the burden
Yep.
is on the Labor Party now to show that they're as equally tough on China. We've heard it from Anthony Albanese a few times this week where he's saying China has changed, especially in the last 5 years under Xi Jinping.
Breaking news overnight. There's been an unexpected but not entirely unpredictable development in the federal election campaign. Anthony Albanese testing positive to COVID.
No, if this was a movie, this is the big twist in the movie. Albo's had a rocky start, he's starting to gain a bit of momentum, and the big twist comes along, and now we need a hero to save the day. The question is, who's going to be that saviour?
Well, that's a good question. Labor at this stage are still figuring exactly that out. All plans are up in the air at the moment.
40 or 50,000 Aussies a day getting it. It's almost inevitable that it's going to happen.
How are you feeling?
Good afternoon, Fran. Well, I've had better days.
It was, in some senses, anticipated, and everyone had been told for weeks we'll have contingency A and contingency B. But what do we understand about all these contingency plans?
Well, yeah, Labor said they've been, wargaming. Jason Clare said this morning that there's going to be no acting leader, so we do know that we won't see kind of one person come in and take over Anthony Albanese's role, and we can expect to see kind of a few different people step up.
And then there's the question of what a remotely involved Anthony Albanese campaign might look like. Now, there are people who say in the contingency playbook was the setting up of audio-visual equipment so that he can broadcast from his Sydney home, flashback to Joe Biden, for instance, in the US presidential